Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. First published in 1936, Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell is a monumental work in American literature. Set in the American South during the Civil War and Reconstruction era, the novel captures not just a love story, but the transformation of an entire way of life. It is at once a sweeping romantic epic and a complex historical narrative, woven together with themes of survival, pride, and the merciless passage of time. The title itself, taken from a poem by Ernest Dowson, speaks to the fading of the Old South, of plantations and traditions blown away by the winds of war and change. The novel earned Mitchell the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1937 and was famously adapted into a 1939 film that became one of Hollywood's most iconic productions. But even as it enjoys a place in the pantheon of American classics, Gone with the Wind has not escaped controversy. Its portrayal of slavery, Black characters, and the romanticizing of the Confederate South has drawn significant criticism, especially in recent decades. These issues must be acknowledged, not glossed over, as they form an integral part of how the book has been received and reinterpreted across generations. Still, what makes Gone with the Wind endure is its unflinching portrayal of its central character, Scarlett O'Hara, a woman as bold, cunning, and flawed as any ever written. Through her eyes, readers witness the devastation of war, the collapse of social order, and the harrowing demands of survival in a world where everything familiar disappears. Scarlett's determination to live, to succeed, and to never go hungry again forms the heartbeat of this vast and turbulent story. As we step into the world of Tara, 12 Oaks, and war-torn Atlanta, remember, this is not just a love story. It is a story of loss and endurance, pride and downfall, and above all, the quiet desperation of those left to rebuild what the wind has torn apart. Scarlett O'Hara was not beautiful, but men seldom realized it when caught by her charm, as the very first line of the novel tells us. At 16, Scarlett reigns as the belle of Clayton County, Georgia. Dressed in green muslin and full of flirtation, she sits on the porch of Tara, her family's cotton plantation, entertaining the Tarleton twins. There's a flicker of worry in the air, talk of war, and the growing tensions between the North and South. But to Scarlett, these are distant thunderclouds. What matters more than politics is Ashley Wilkes and the barbecue tomorrow at 12 Oaks. Ashley, the quiet, introspective heir to the neighboring plantation, is the man Scarlett believes she loves. He is everything she is not: reserved, intellectual, drawn to poetry and honor. And perhaps that's exactly why she desires him. But there's a cruel twist. Ashley is about to announce his engagement to Melanie Hamilton, his gentle and proper cousin from Atlanta. This news sends a ripple through Scarlett's heart, and in her impulsive pride, she decides she cannot let it go unanswered. At the barbecue at 12 Oaks, with the scent of roasting meat in the air and the world still seemingly untouched by the war looming on the horizon, Scarlett makes a bold move. She corners Ashley in the library and declares her love. But Ashley, though clearly torn, remains firm his path is with Melanie, not Scarlett. The rejection stings more than she can bear, and in the shadow of her humiliation, a man rises from a corner of the room. Rhett Butler, a visitor from Charleston with a reputation for scandal and cynicism, has overheard everything. From the very first moment, Rhett is intrigued. He is not like the Southern gentleman Scarlett is used to manipulating. He laughs at convention, at propriety, and most dangerously, he sees through her. Scarlett, humiliated and furious, leaves the room with her pride bruised but not broken. Almost immediately, the world begins to change. The Civil War erupts with a flurry of patriotic speeches and celebratory cheers. The young men rush to enlist, dreaming of glory and honor. Scarlett, in a moment of desperation and calculation, marries Charles Hamilton, Melanie's brother, not for love, but to make Ashley jealous. It is a decision she makes flippantly, and one that will shape the next chapter of her life. Scarlett becomes a widow within months. Charles dies of illness in a Confederate camp before he even sees battle. Now, 17 and in mourning, Scarlett finds herself trapped in the suffocating role of a grieving widow, dressed in black, forbidden to dance or enjoy life. It is a role that chafes against her nature. The fire in her hasn't gone out. It's only simmering, waiting for a chance to rise again. Her mother, Ellen O'Hara, worried about Scarlett's restlessness and vanity, sends her to Atlanta to stay with Aunt Pitapat and Melanie, hoping the city's slower pace and traditional values will tame her. But Atlanta is not a city of quiet. It is alive with the hum of war, the injured pouring in, the society women organizing hospitals, and the growing presence of the Union threat. In Atlanta, Scarlett finds herself surrounded by people who expect her to mourn quietly, serve others, and think only of the Confederacy. But even in black veils and hushed rooms, her defiance flickers. She dances with Rhett Butler at a charity ball, scandalizing the town, but raising a fortune for the war effort. Rhett, ever watchful, ever mocking, becomes both her critic and her protector. He's drawn to her spirit, and she to his mystery, though she won't admit it. Ashley returns to Atlanta briefly on furlough. Scarlett clings to him, still believing he is the love of her life. But he remains emotionally distant, bound by honor to Melanie. And Melanie, sweet, sincere, and surprisingly strong, adores Scarlett as a sister. It is a bond Scarlett doesn't want but cannot break. Despite herself, she begins to rely on Melanie's quiet support and loyalty, even as she dreams of stealing her husband. As the war drags on and the South begins to weaken, Atlanta becomes a city under siege. Food grows scarce. Hope grows thinner. The illusion of Southern invincibility begins to crack, and with it, the old world that Scarlett once knew. But in the ruins of her expectations, she begins to discover something else, an inner steel, a will to survive. The story of Scarlett O'Hara is just beginning. The plantation days of balls and flirtation are gone. The drums of war are growing louder, and the choices ahead will demand far more than charm and beauty. They will require sacrifice, cunning, and the kind of courage that doesn't wear a uniform. Atlanta pulsed with the feverish energy of a city on the brink. Soldiers passed through its streets in droves, wounded and weary, some never to return home. The once grand avenues were now crowded with wagons, stretchers, and the dull hum of whispered prayers. Scarlett O'Hara, although far removed from the front lines, began to feel the encroaching heat of war pressing into her privileged world. She had come to Atlanta seeking comfort and distance from the sorrow that had gripped Tara. But the war, as if seeking her out personally, had found her again. The Wilkeses' home had become her refuge, though she often bristled in Melanie's presence. Scarlett bore her cousin's kindness with strained tolerance, masking her envy behind tight smiles and polite gestures. Melanie was gentle and warm-hearted, but to Scarlett, she was the silent rival who had taken Ashley, the only man she believed she could ever love. Every soft glance between Melanie and Ashley, every gesture of intimacy remembered from their wedding day, twisted like a thorn in Scarlett's chest. Yet, she hid her jealousy behind the duties expected of a proper Southern lady, even as resentment grew in the quiet shadows of her mind. Rhett Butler's name echoed frequently in Atlanta's gossip circles, always laced with scandal or admiration, sometimes both. He had become a figure both feared and envied. To some, he was the very embodiment of disgrace, a blockade runner, a profiteer, a man who boasted openly of his disdain for Confederate romanticism. To others, especially women like Scarlett, he was an unpredictable force, dangerous, alluring, and maddeningly indifferent to their judgment. When Rhett visited, his presence cut through rooms like a blade, setting people on edge. He spoke truths no one dared voice, and smirked when others gasped. Scarlett found herself tangled in Rhett's web of amused provocations. He made no effort to hide his interest in her, though she suspected his motives were far from sentimental. He teased her about Ashley and laughed at her attempts to play the grieving widow. Still, when he brought her a lush Parisian hat during a time of fabric shortages, her heart raced with the thrill of indulgence. Against Melanie's disapproval, Scarlett wore the gift with pride, reveling in the silk and feathers that reminded her of the days when beauty and attention had come effortlessly. Rhett's attentions confused her. He seemed to understand her in ways no one else did. He saw her pride, her ambition, her cunning, and rather than recoil from them, he seemed entertained. But Scarlett did not want to be understood. She wanted to be adored, and she wanted Ashley. No amount of witty banter or fine gifts from Rhett could distract her from the hollow longing that grew heavier with every passing day. When word came of the Battle of Gettysburg, the mood across Atlanta collapsed into despair. The South had lost, and the cost had been unthinkable. The hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Carriages carried broken bodies through the streets. Scarlett tried to maintain her composure, but the fear was unmistakable. What if Ashley had died? What if her dreams had perished with him on some blood-soaked hill? She gripped each newspaper with trembling fingers, scanning lists of the dead and missing, waiting for some sign of the man who haunted her every thought. Miraculously, Ashley returned on furlough, his uniform tattered and his spirit drained, but alive. Scarlett's heart soared and sank in the same breath. Seeing him again reignited all the emotions she had fought to suppress. She clung to every word he spoke, watching his face for flickers of emotion, hoping he would admit he loved her too. But Ashley, ever the gentleman, remained distant. His loyalty to Melanie had not wavered. In a quiet moment, Scarlett dared confess her feelings again, hoping that time and war had softened his resolve. Ashley's answer came in a quiet plea, not for love, but for a promise. He asked Scarlett to look after Melanie if he did not return, to be her protector and confidante. Scarlett forced a smile through her breaking heart and agreed. It was not what she wanted, but it was something some tether to him, however small. Melanie's joy upon hearing of her pregnancy was sincere and radiant. Scarlett, meanwhile, felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her. The news stung worse than any wound. A child would bind Ashley to Melanie forever, in a way Scarlett could never hope to overcome. And yet, duty demanded she smile, that she sew baby clothes and attend to Melanie's every need. She hated herself for resenting a woman who had shown her nothing but kindness. When news came that Ashley had been captured and sent to a Union prison, Melanie nearly collapsed. Scarlett watched her cling to hope with a quiet strength, and for the first time, a strange respect stirred in her. Melanie, frail and sweet, possessed a resolve that Scarlett could not understand, yet could not deny. Scarlett felt torn between her envy and her reluctant admiration. Rhett, hearing of Ashley's capture, promised to use his influence and wealth to help locate him. His willingness to assist, a man he likely considered a fool, surprised Scarlett. It wasn't heroism, he said with a smirk, merely good business. But Scarlett saw something in his eyes that hinted at more. Rhett, too, seemed caught in the web of these turbulent relationships, playing his own game of pride and pretense. The war crept closer to Atlanta's gates, bringing with it hunger, disease, and the slow unraveling of the Southern way of life. As society cracked under the strain, Scarlett's instincts sharpened. Her vanity, once her greatest flaw, began to harden into something else, endurance, maybe even strength. She spent long days in makeshift hospitals, helping Melanie and others tend to soldiers whose limbs were gone, whose eyes had dimmed with agony. Each passing day burned away more of her old self. The fluttery coquette of Tara was vanishing. In her place, a woman was emerging, one who watched, listened, calculated. Scarlett didn't yet know who she was becoming, but she knew that survival, not propriety, would guide her. Love was no longer a fantasy. It had become a battleground of its own, where Scarlett fought not just for a man's affection, but for her identity in a world unrecognizable from the one she'd once ruled. Atlanta, once the proud jewel of the South, now groaned under the weight of war. Cannon fire echoed faintly in the distance, like the slow, rumbling approach of an unstoppable force. In the hospitals, the scent of blood and lye was heavy in the air, clinging to every sheet, every gown, every soul who dared walk those hallways. Scarlett had grown used to the cries of the wounded, the fevered moans of boys no older than Beau, and the sudden, suffocating silence that followed death. Her delicate hands, once admired for their beauty, now bore the calluses of war, scrubbing floors, changing bandages, lifting bodies. Melanie, now pregnant and increasingly frail, refused to stop helping. She believed it was her Christian duty, and though Scarlett privately found it foolish, she remained by her side. There were moments in the middle of the night when Melanie's soft voice calmed a dying soldier that Scarlett felt something like shame. Melanie's goodness was not an act, it was deep, instinctive, and real. Scarlett couldn't understand it, but part of her began to rely on it, as if Melanie's gentleness might somehow protect them both from the crumbling world outside. When Rhett Butler returned to Atlanta, it was with a flourish, as always. His clothes were immaculate despite the shortages, his carriage lined with silk, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He came and went at will, defying every rule of blockade running and decorum alike. While other men stumbled home broken, Rhett thrived in the chaos, growing richer with each passing month. Scarlett found herself drawn to him more and more, not because he offered security, but because he reminded her of herself. He understood that survival was not about honor or nobility. It was about doing whatever it took. Their interactions remained a game of sharp words and pointed glances. Scarlett still refused to admit she cared for him, and Rhett never pretended to offer love. He was amused by her vanity, intrigued by her ambition, but he refused to worship her the way Ashley had in her dreams. And yet, in quiet moments, he showed a strange tenderness, bringing her oranges when she was sick, defending her when tongues wagged about her boldness, giving her looks that lingered longer than they should. As the Union Army crept closer, Atlanta transformed into a city of fear. The constant rumble of war drums gave way to the booming of real cannon fire. Windows shattered, buildings shook, and smoke choked the sky. People who had once strutted with pride now scurried like rats, eyes wide with panic. Refugees crowded the streets, women clutched babies to their chests, and the wounded seemed to multiply by the hour. Still, Scarlett refused to leave. Her pride would not allow it. To flee would be to admit defeat, and Scarlett O'Hara did not surrender. Then came the news no one wanted to believe: Sherman's troops were moving in. Panic turned to hysteria. Men burned crops and supplies to keep them from Union hands. Women wept openly in church pews. Scarlett, though terrified, stood firm. Melanie had gone into labor, and Scarlett would not leave her. Not now. Not when the house shook with cannon fire and Union soldiers were a day's march away. Her resolve became steel. She boiled water, gathered linens, and with Prissy, the young house servant whose confidence far exceeded her experience, prepared for a birth she had no idea how to manage. Melanie's labor was long and excruciating. The screams tore through the house like shrapnel. Scarlett had never witnessed such pain. She begged Prissy to fetch the doctor, only to discover the girl had lied. She didn't know how to deliver a baby at all. Rage boiled inside Scarlett, but there was no time for fury. There was only Melanie, pale and shaking, her body wrecked by effort, whispering Ashley's name between cries. Scarlett gritted her teeth and did what she had always done, took control. Hours passed in a blur of sweat and panic. Finally, with trembling hands, Scarlett brought Melanie's child into the world. It was a girl, tiny, red-faced, and crying. Melanie sobbed weakly, clinging to Scarlett's hand, her gratitude pouring out in breathless thanks. Scarlett sat beside her, numb with exhaustion and disbelief. She had done it. She had helped bring life into a world drowning in death, and now they had to escape. The city was burning. The sky glowed orange with the fires of retreat. Confederate soldiers set flames to their own supply depots, determined not to leave anything for the Yankees. Explosions rocked the night. Scarlett wrapped Melanie and the baby in blankets, threw whatever she could into a wagon, and dragged Prissy along. The streets were choked with smoke and screams, but Scarlett pushed forward. There was no more time for fear. Tara was the only hope now. Their journey from Atlanta to Tara was brutal. The roads were blocked with debris and refugees. Horses were scarce, so Scarlett bribed a broken-down old man to give her his. The wagon groaned under their weight. Melanie faded in and out of consciousness. The baby cried from hunger. Prissy was useless, wailing at every bump in the road. Scarlett pressed on. She passed fields of ash and blood. Trees lay twisted and blackened. Homes were gutted, their porches sagging like broken bones. The war had devoured the South she once knew. Scarlett's dress was torn, her hair tangled, her hands raw from gripping the reins. But her mind was sharp. Get home, get to Tara. That was all that mattered. When the silhouette of Tara finally appeared on the horizon, Scarlett almost cried. But what she found there was no longer the safe haven of her childhood. The fields were stripped bare. The house stood, but barely. Her mother was dead. Her father, once so proud and strong, wandered the halls like a ghost, his mind lost. Her sisters were thin and hollow-eyed. The once mighty O'Hara family had been shattered by the war. But Scarlett had returned. And though the land was dying, it was still theirs. Her grief, her heartbreak, her exhaustion, none of it would stop her now. Scarlett stood on the porch of Tara, dust in her lungs, blood on her dress, and swore she would never go hungry again. Not her, not her family. She would fight. She would claw and scrape and steal if she had to. Whatever it took to survive, she would do it. Because in the ruins of the South, only the ruthless would endure. The wind swept across the desolate fields of Tara, carrying with it the ash and silence of a South defeated. The once fertile soil lay bare, stripped of crops, stripped of hope. Scarlett stood in the doorway of her childhood home, staring at what remained of a life that no longer existed. The grandeur of the O'Hara plantation was gone, reduced to its bones. The white columns still stood, but the house felt like a tomb, silent, lifeless, and steeped in sorrow. Inside, the air was thick with mourning. Ellen O'Hara, the pillar of grace and strength, was dead. Scarlett had missed her mother's final moments, and the realization gnawed at her. She had always believed her mother to be invincible, a figure too strong to fall to anything as mundane as illness. But typhoid had taken her, swiftly and cruelly. Gerald, once the indomitable Irishman who ruled Tara with laughter and fire, now wandered the halls in a daze, his mind untethered from reality. He spoke to Ellen as if she were still alive, tending to invisible tasks, smiling at shadows. The war had broken him in ways no bullet ever could. Scarlett took in the state of her sisters. Carrien was sickly and fragile, her spirit dimmed, and Suellen had turned bitter, her pride bruised by the collapse of their social world. They looked to Scarlett with a mixture of desperation and resentment, waiting for her to take charge. And she did, because there was no one else who could. Melanie, weak and barely able to walk, did what she could, nursing the baby and offering gentle comfort. Scarlett found strength in her presence, even if she never admitted it aloud. Food was scarce. The Yankees had stripped the countryside bare, and what little remained had to be hoarded and rationed. Scarlett, who once refused to lift a finger in the kitchen, now dug in the dirt for vegetables, milked the one scrawny cow they had managed to keep hidden, and hunted for anything remotely edible. Her hands became rough, her back sore from work, but she did not complain. She had made a vow never to be hungry again, and she meant to keep it, even if it meant stealing, lying, or killing. Scarlett's determination hardened her. The softness of her youth was gone, replaced by something sharp and unrelenting. She became the protector, the provider, the unyielding force that held Tara together. There were moments she stared into the cracked mirror in Ellen's old room and didn't recognize the woman who looked back, eyes shadowed, mouth tight, hair pulled back with no thought for beauty. But there was no time for self-pity. The war was still raging, and survival demanded sacrifice. Yankee soldiers passed through frequently, looting, threatening, and mocking. Scarlett learned quickly to hide what little they had. She buried silver in the garden, lied through her teeth when questioned, and kept a rifle by the door. When a Union deserter broke into the house one night, demanding valuables and sneering at the women's vulnerability, Scarlett did not hesitate. She shot him dead with her father's pistol. Her hands shook, her breath came in gasps, but she did not cry. She simply dragged his body out with Melanie's help and buried it in the orchard. There was no room left for innocence. Even as Scarlett worked to preserve Tara, she realized they would not survive long without money. The taxes alone were crippling, and there was no one left to help. Ashley was still in a Yankee prison camp. Rhett had vanished from Atlanta. The banks were gone, the Confederacy collapsing. Desperation clawed at her, and once again she turned to her instincts, to scheme, to manipulate, to do what others wouldn't. She journeyed back to Atlanta in search of aid, but what she found was a city as broken as Tara. The proud homes were charred shells, businesses shuttered, familiar faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. Scarlett moved through it with steely focus. She visited Rhett in jail, where he had been held under suspicion of holding Confederate gold. She hoped to charm him into lending her the money to pay the taxes on Tara. But Rhett, amused and infuriating as always, saw through her. He admired her ruthlessness, but he would not be played. His fortune, he claimed, was beyond her reach now. Scarlett left him seething with frustration and wandered the streets of Atlanta until an idea took root, one that revolted and thrilled her in equal measure. Frank Kennedy, her sister Sue Ellen's suitor, had opened a small business. He was no Rhett Butler, but he had money. And Scarlett needed that money, so she lied. She told Frank that Sue Ellen had grown tired of waiting and married another man. Then she married Frank herself. It was a betrayal of her sister, a cold and calculated move, but Scarlett no longer dealt in sentiment. She dealt in results. With Frank's resources and her cunning, Scarlett expanded his business. She used her charm, her knowledge of lumber, and her utter lack of shame to negotiate, intimidate, and undercut competitors. People whispered about her behind closed doors, a woman working in trade, a woman driving a wagon alone, a woman unashamed to deal with Yankees. But Scarlett didn't care. Gossip couldn't feed her family. What mattered was that she was finally in control, wielding power in a world where women were supposed to be helpless. Scarlett's marriage to Frank was one of convenience, not affection. She grew restless, frustrated with his weakness and timidity. He begged her to be more ladylike, to stop embarrassing him in public, to let him run his business. But Scarlett had long outgrown the role of the obedient Southern belle. She ran the business because Frank was too cautious. She faced danger head-on while he fretted over appearances. Their arguments grew frequent, and Scarlett began to regret the match. But she didn't stop pushing. She couldn't afford to. Atlanta, meanwhile, was a powder keg of resentment and fear. The city had been reclaimed by the South in name only. Reconstruction brought chaos. Freed slaves searched for family and homes. Carpetbaggers, northern opportunists, swept in with money and ambition. Former Confederates seethed in silence, their pride smoldering beneath their words. Violence lurked just under the surface, and Scarlett, though indifferent to politics, found herself caught in its current. Through it all, Scarlett remained resolute. She had become something new, something unrecognizable to those who once praised her beauty and charm. She was a businesswoman, a provider, a survivor. And though the world around her continued to fall apart, she held Tara and her family together with a strength born of fire and loss. The winds of change did not ease with time. They grew fiercer, more unpredictable. Scarlett had become a force in Atlanta, but her climb came at a cost. The society that once worshipped her now gossiped in hushed tones. She had become a symbol of everything they claimed to despise, a woman who worked in trade, who defied her husband, who courted scandal without so much as a blush. and yet they could not look away. She was too dazzling in her audacity, too unapologetic in her ambition. Frank Kennedy, her second husband, was no match for her fire. He was a man of gentle manners and cautious habits, and he found himself constantly overwhelmed by the storm that was Scarlett. Their home was no sanctuary. It was a battlefield of clashing wills. Frank begged her to retreat from the world of lumber and debt collection, but Scarlett refused. There was no going back to idle days and embroidery. She had tasted independence, and she could not give it up, not even to preserve what little remained of her reputation. Her business tactics were shrewd, sometimes ruthless. She hired convict labor when others hesitated, purchased supplies from Yankees, and confronted threats on her own terms. There were whispers about her meetings with men in back rooms, her boldness in hiring former slaves, and her dealings with Reconstruction officials. But she never flinched. In the chaos of the post-war South, she understood something that many refused to accept. Sentiment was a luxury. Survival was the only currency that mattered. It was during these tumultuous days that Rhett Butler returned to her life with full force. He had been released from jail and re-entered Atlanta with the same devil-may-care attitude that made him so magnetic. But beneath his swagger lay calculation. He had made money during the war through questionable means, and now he was richer than ever. Scarlett, still reeling from the failure to secure his help when Tara needed it most, greeted him with a mix of contempt and fascination. Rhett, for his part, seemed amused by her transformation. He saw through her pretenses, her schemes, and her marriages. He teased her with a knowing smile, calling her out on every lie, every manipulation. But he also admired her. In a world where everyone else clung to illusions of the past, Scarlett lived in the brutal now. She was raw, unfiltered, and entirely herself, even when she tried not to be. Their encounters were electric. Every word was a challenge, every glance a test. Rhett refused to worship her as others once had, and that maddened Scarlett. She wanted his admiration, but not at the cost of vulnerability. He, in turn, wanted her honesty, but knew she'd never offer it freely. They danced around their desire, each too proud to yield first. As tensions in Atlanta reached a boiling point, danger became a constant shadow. The streets were no longer safe, especially for a woman as visible and controversial as Scarlett. One night, while driving alone through a rough part of town, she was attacked by a group of men. Though she escaped with her life, the incident sent shockwaves through her household and the community. Frank and other former Confederates, still seething over their losses and threatened by the changes brought by Reconstruction, formed a secretive vigilante group to retaliate. They called it self-defense, but their actions were fueled by pride and fear. The raid that followed Scarlett's attack turned deadly. Frank was among those killed. Scarlett was devastated, though not so much from grief as from guilt and anger. She had pushed Frank into a world he was not built for, into dangers he would have otherwise avoided. And now she was widowed again, her name further stained, her business more vulnerable than ever. Rhett stepped into the chaos with his usual blend of sarcasm and heroism. He used his connections and charm to protect Ashley Wilkes, who had also been involved in the raid, from arrest. He swept in, took control of the narrative, and for once, appeared to be acting out of more than just self-interest. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the rumors thickened, Rhett made a proposition that caught Scarlett entirely off guard. He wanted to marry her. Not for love, he claimed, but for convenience, for mutual benefit. Scarlett, shocked and uncertain, didn't know how to respond. Part of her longed for the security Rhett could offer, especially now, with Frank gone and her name under siege. But another part, the part still obsessed with Ashley, hesitated. Ashley remained the ghost Scarlett couldn't exorcise. He was no longer the golden boy of her youth. The war had aged him, drained him of fire, and yet Scarlett clung to the memory of what he once was. She saw his devotion to Melanie, his quiet sadness, and interpreted it as a sign that he still loved her, still wanted her. She was blind to his reality, deaf to his polite refusals. Her love for him had become a fantasy, a fortress against the uncertainties of the world. Melanie, ever graceful and kind, continued to see only the best in Scarlett. She defended her against gossip, offered her a place in society that others would deny, and trusted her without question. It was this unshakable loyalty that made Scarlett's obsession with Ashley all the more tragic. She could not bring herself to betray Melanie outright, but she could not let go of the dream either. In the end, Scarlett accepted Rhett's proposal. They were married in a grand ceremony that stunned Atlanta. It was not a marriage built on love, but on mutual recognition. Rhett understood her hunger for control, her disdain for convention. He respected her grit, even as he mocked her illusions. Scarlett saw in him a partner who could match her ambition, challenge her schemes, and perhaps, in time, soothe the restless ache in her soul. Their union was a spectacle, both celebrated and condemned. Scarlett now had wealth, power, and status. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks had already begun to form. Rhett wanted her heart, though he'd never admit it. Scarlett wanted validation, still chasing Ashley's ghost. Neither knew how to surrender, and both carried wounds that words couldn't heal. Together, they stood at the center of a world still burning, its past in ashes, its future uncertain. But for now, they had each other, and the war within had only just begun. Married life with Rhett Butler was nothing like the fairy tales Scarlett might have imagined in her youth. There were carriages and jewels, fine houses and lavish parties. Yes, but these were mere trimmings. What lay beneath the surface was far more complicated. Rhett gave her the world, but not his heart. And Scarlett, ever chasing illusions, failed to notice that the very thing she had once longed for a man willing to match her fire was slipping through her fingers, inch by inch. Their home on Peachtree Street was a marvel. Built with grandeur and filled with luxury, it became the talk of Atlanta. Scarlett enjoyed the attention it brought, the way people looked at her with envy, even as they whispered behind her back. She had fought her way to the top, and now she walked among the city's elite. Yet in the quiet of their opulent home, silence often lingered longer than laughter. Rhett, for all his indulgences, remained a mystery. He doted on Scarlett in public, showering her with gifts and flattering words. But in private, he kept a part of himself guarded. He teased her still, with the same mocking grin and half-lidded eyes, but there was something different behind his gaze now, something wearier, more wounded. He had hoped, perhaps, that with time Scarlett would see him not as a convenience or a rogue, but as a man worthy of love. Yet she remained stubbornly blind, her heart shackled to a dream that had long since withered. Ashley Wilkes still haunted Scarlett's thoughts, like a ghost refusing to fade. Even as the world shifted around them, even as she stood beside a husband who adored her in his own strange way, Scarlett's mind turned always to Ashley. His melancholy, his gentle manners, his loyalty to Melanie, all of it only deepened her obsession. She mistook his politeness for longing, his sadness for secret desire. Her longing had become a habit, and her delusion was now a part of her identity. When Scarlett gave birth to Bonnie Blue Butler, a spark of genuine happiness illuminated their lives. The little girl, with her dark curls and violet eyes, was adored by all, but none more than her father. Rhett loved Bonnie with a tenderness he rarely showed the world. She became his pride and his joy, a symbol of the innocence he believed he had lost. He doted on her endlessly, spoiled her with gifts, and spoke of her future with uncharacteristic hope. Scarlett, too, loved Bonnie, though she often found herself at odds with Rhett over how to raise her. He insisted on pony rides, laughter, and freedom. Scarlett demanded discipline, tradition, and poise. Their clashing ideas spilled into arguments, and the walls of their grand home began to echo with resentment. The love they had tried to build stood on shaky ground, and Bonnie, though cherished, could not fix what had already begun to break. Melanie, ever the gentle anchor in Scarlett's life, continued to believe in her friend's goodness. She welcomed Scarlett into her home, trusted her with secrets, and praised her courage to others. Her faith, quiet and unwavering, was a constant reminder of the grace Scarlett could never quite attain. Even Ashley, now managing the remnants of his family's legacy, seemed more resigned than passionate. He carried himself like a man still living in a world that no longer existed, clinging to honor while everything else crumbled. As Atlanta changed, so did its people. The Reconstruction government shifted power dynamics, and with the emergence of new money and new rules, the old guard began to fade. Scarlett's businesses thrived, yet she found no comfort in prosperity. Her reputation remained tarnished, and even among her riches, she felt like an outsider. The South she had known was gone, and no amount of money could bring it back. Rhett began to retreat more often late nights out, sudden trips, and long silences. He grew colder when Scarlett brought up Ashley, his tolerance fraying with each careless remark. He knew she had never loved him, not truly, and the weight of that truth pressed heavier with every passing day. Still, he didn't leave. Not yet. Something kept him tethered, perhaps pride, perhaps Bonnie, perhaps the faint hope that Scarlett might one day love him the way he had once dreamed. But Scarlett remained blind, clinging to the belief that Ashley was the key to her happiness. Even after all the years, after all the pain, she still believed that if he would just admit his love, everything would fall into place. Her stubbornness, once a survival tool, now worked against her. She refused to see what was right in front of her, a man who had once loved her, yes, but who now belonged wholly to someone else. Then came the day when tragedy struck with cruel swiftness. Bonnie, fearless like her mother and headstrong like her father, insisted on riding her pony without supervision. Rhett had spoiled her with the best saddle, the finest riding gear, and no shortage of affection. But all the love in the world could not shield her from fate. In an instant, everything shattered. Bonnie was thrown from the pony and killed. The loss hollowed Rhett. The man who had faced war, scandal, and heartbreak with a sardonic smile was brought to his knees. He refused to let go of Bonnie's body, barricading himself in her nursery, cradling her in his arms, whispering to her as though she might wake up. The city watched in stunned silence as Rhett unraveled. It was Melanie who finally reached him, who walked into the room and persuaded him to say goodbye. Scarlett, overcome with guilt and grief, stood helpless on the outside. That moment was a reckoning. Rhett's heartbreak was too deep, too consuming. Whatever fragile bond he and Scarlett had forged had snapped. He looked at her not with love or anger, but with emptiness. Something had died in him, something that no longer looked for hope in her eyes. Their home, once vibrant and full of conflict, grew cold. Words were few, glances vacant. Rhett no longer teased her, no longer challenged her. He began to drift, emotionally and physically, until one day, it became clear that he was ready to leave. And still, Scarlett didn't understand, not fully. Not until the silence became unbearable. What once had shimmered with potential now stood in ruins. Love, pride, ambition, they had all collided, leaving behind two people who no longer knew how to reach each other. Scarlett had won every battle, but somehow she had lost the war that mattered most. Scarlett stood in the remnants of what had once been a life built on stubborn will and iron resolve, watching it unravel strand by delicate strand. The death of Bonnie had changed everything. It wasn't just grief that filled the halls of their grand house. It was silence, raw and unrelenting. Rhett, once so animated with mocking laughter and dangerous charm, had become a shadow of himself. He no longer argued, no longer challenged, no longer even looked at Scarlett with the intensity she had come to expect. There was nothing left in his eyes but a dim, distant sorrow, a man mourning not only a daughter, but the pieces of his own soul. Scarlett had thought pain was something to be resisted, outlasted, beaten down with sheer grit, like hunger during the war or the ruin of Tara. But this pain was different. It lived with her, breathed in the quiet spaces, seeped into her chest at night and made it hard to breathe. She watched Rhett drift farther each day, and for the first time, she began to understand what she had squandered. Not just a marriage or a man, but a love that had been real, if only she'd let herself believe it. In those days, Melanie became once again the center of what little calm remained. Her quiet grace wrapped around everyone who came near her. Even in her frailty, because she was growing weaker, her strength failing in ways no one would yet name, she remained the emotional backbone of their circle. She visited Scarlett, offered gentle comfort, and never once hinted at the betrayal that simmered under the surface. For all Scarlett's longing glances at Ashley, for all the stolen moments and clumsy emotions, Melanie never spoke a word against her. But Ashley knew. He had always known. The weight of Scarlett's affection had worn him down over the years. He loved Melanie, not with fire and thunder, but with the steady reverence of a man who knew he'd been given more than he deserved. The past had never truly let him go, and yet he had chosen to live in the present for his wife, for their son, for the legacy of honor he tried so hard to uphold. When he looked at Scarlett now, it was with pity, with guilt, but no longer with longing. Then came the blow that finally broke the fragile illusions Scarlett had clung to for so long. Melanie, her health quietly deteriorating, collapsed one afternoon and was rushed to her bed. The doctors spoke in hushed tones. There was no recovering this time. Death loomed nearby, soft-footed but certain. In her final hours, Melanie called for Scarlett. It was a moment Scarlett would never forget. In that dim room, with the air heavy and still, Melanie grasped her hand and whispered words that tore through her pride. She spoke of love, of forgiveness, of trust. She begged Scarlett to take care of Ashley and their child, to remain strong, to be kind. There was no accusation, no bitterness, only a final act of grace from a woman who had always seen the best in others, even when they didn't deserve it. Scarlett left Melanie's side changed. The illusion shattered. She no longer fooled herself into thinking she loved Ashley. It had never been love, not really, only an infatuation, a stubborn dream of what might have been. Her true love, the only man who had matched her in strength and spirit, was Rhett, and she had driven him away. She rushed home, heart pounding with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. Rhett had to know. It wasn't too late. She would tell him everything, that she was wrong, that she had loved him all along, that she finally understood. But when she arrived, suitcase in hand, he was already packed. He stood there, calm, collected, every line of his face drawn with finality. He had made up his mind. He was leaving, and no plea would stop him. She begged, her words tumbling out in desperation. She spoke of love, of change, of the future they could still have. But Rhett had heard it all before, or at least he thought he had. He didn't believe her. Not anymore. She asked him, voice breaking, "Where shall I go? What shall I do?" He looked at her, his eyes hollow with all the grief he no longer had the strength to carry, and said the words that would echo in her memory forever. "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." Then he was gone. Scarlett stood alone on the grand staircase of their home, the echo of his footsteps fading into the distance. For a long moment, she was paralyzed, not with despair, but with the weight of realization. Everything she had fought for, every manipulation, every battle, every hardened choice, it had all brought her here, to this empty house, and the sound of a door closing for good. But even then, Scarlett O'Hara was not one to give up. She collapsed in her room, her tears hot against her cheeks, and thought not of what she had lost, but of what she might still reclaim. Tara called to her like an anchor, its red soil promising the comfort of home, of beginnings. She would go back, rest, gather her strength. And when the time was right, she would try again. She believed, as she always had, that tomorrow was another day. Tara stood silent under the pale light of a Georgia dawn, its familiar fields cloaked in morning mist. The once crimson earth now whispered of quiet endurance rather than defiance. Scarlett returned to it like a wounded soldier to a battlefield, broken but not beaten. The big house loomed in the distance, not as grand as before the war, but solid, standing, unchanged in ways she desperately needed something to be. Tara had always been more than land to her. It was identity, sanctuary, the one place where life, no matter how cruel, had to begin again. Inside, the routines of farm life beat on in gentle rhythm. Mammy, older and grayer now, embraced her with gruff affection, her voice cracking as she muttered half-hearted scoldings about the state Scarlett was in. Suellen and Karine tried to show sympathy, but neither could truly understand the storm that had ravaged Scarlett's life. It wasn't just Rhett's leaving or Melanie's death. It was the collapse of the person she used to be. The fire that had once defined her had dwindled to embers. But in Tara's quiet hum of chores and cycles and soil, she began to find her breath again. Her mind wandered constantly to Rhett, not to the man who had left her, but to the man she had so often misunderstood. His laughter, his cynicism, the way he had seen through her when no one else dared to, these memories haunted her more than any loss. She saw now how much he had given her, how much he had endured for the love she had squandered. He had wanted all of her strength, her flaws, her love, and she had held back, clinging to a fantasy of Ashley that had long since withered. Ashley himself was lost in grief. Melanie's death had hollowed him in ways Scarlett had not expected. He was no longer the gallant dreamer of her youth, but a broken man, weighed down by the emptiness left in his wife's absence. Scarlett tried, at first, to be a comfort to him, fulfilling the promise she had made to Melanie on her deathbed. But it quickly became clear that she could not fill that void for him, nor could he fill hers. The illusions that had tethered them together finally snapped, and with it, a strange peace settled between them. Scarlett no longer needed Ashley. She no longer even wanted him. What had once seemed like love had been nothing more than longing for something unattainable. Slowly, Scarlett began to rebuild herself, not with the defiant pride of youth, but with quiet introspection. She worked the land, oversaw the house, and took comfort in the dependable rhythms of Tara. She watched seasons change and let herself grieve for Bonnie, for Melanie, for the version of herself that could have been gentler, more open, more honest, and for Rhett, always Rhett, whose absence weighed more than any memory. Then came the moment she could no longer ignore the truth. If she wanted Rhett back, she would have to fight. Not with manipulation or tears, but with something she had never given freely before, humility. She had always believed she could bend the world to her will, but now she knew better. People could not be bent like land. They had to be loved, understood, nurtured. Tara had taught her that much at last. She began to plan, not with the calculating strategy of her younger self, but with the resolve of someone who had faced the worst and survived. Atlanta would be her battlefield again, but not with fire and conquest this time, with truth. She would find Rhett and tell him what she should have told him long ago, that she loved him. Not as a convenience, not as a substitute for Ashley, but for who he truly was. She had loved him without knowing it, and now that she knew, she would never stop trying to make him see it. But Atlanta was not the city she remembered. It bore the scars of war, the echoes of lost grandeur, much like herself. Rhett, too, had changed. When she saw him again, he was cordial but distant, as though he had closed off some chamber of his heart and sealed it for good. He was no longer the passionate, irreverent man who had once lit up her world with fire and danger. He had become careful, watchful, perhaps even resigned. She had waited too long. Still, she tried. She spoke plainly, without pretense. She told him of Bonnie, of Melanie's death, of how she had come to understand what love really meant. Rhett listened quietly, offering no encouragement but no mockery either. He had loved her too deeply once to enjoy her pain. And perhaps, in some hidden place, he still loved her. But love was no longer enough, not after so much damage. He told her as gently as he could that he needed something different now. Peace, rest, a life without constant struggle and emotional warfare. Scarlett's love, though finally real, had come to him like rain to parched earth, too late to bloom. She returned to Tara once more, broken in a new way, not by pride or tragedy, but by a kind of wisdom that only comes with surrender. Rhett was not lost to her forever. She refused to believe that. But she would not chase him blindly anymore. She would heal, she would grow, and if ever he came back to her, it would be because he saw that she had changed. She stood on the porch of Tara as evening fell, the horizon glowing gold with the last rays of sun. Tomorrow would come. It always did. And with it, hope. Scarlett O'Hara had lost everything she had once clung to. But in the quiet of that Georgia twilight, she still believed in beginnings. Because after all, tomorrow was another day. The sunlit days at Tara passed slowly, threaded with a quiet that Scarlett had never known how to live in. For so long, her life had been a storm of ambition, loss, and survival. Now, in the hush that followed, she found herself listening to the sounds she used to ignore. The rustle of wind in the cotton fields, the soft cluck of hens outside the kitchen, the rhythmic creaking of the rocking chair as Mammy sat near the fireplace, her eyes sometimes far away, sometimes watching Scarlett like she was still the reckless girl who needed her voice to guide her. Tara breathed around her, steady and alive, and for the first time in her life, Scarlett didn't want to outrun it. Her days were filled with the labor of restoration, not just of the land, but of herself. She no longer cared to be the belle of Atlanta, no longer needed to prove anything to the city that had crumbled under war, and then judged her for surviving it. The old pride still stirred inside her, but it was tempered now, shaped by loss. The death of Melanie had stripped away her illusions about friendship and love. Bonnie's absence had hollowed out something maternal she hadn't known she possessed. And Rhett's departure, his quiet, resolute walking away, had forced her to look inward, to confront what she had never dared to see, that she had been her own greatest obstacle. Ashley Wilkes was still a ghost of the past, a polite, grieving man who wandered through his days, lost in a sorrow he could not shake. Scarlett visited him out of obligation and memory, but the yearning she had once felt for him was gone. In its place was a cool gratitude for the clarity that time had brought. He had never been the man she imagined, and she had never been the woman he needed. Their story had been a dream woven in the shadows of Tara's porch and broken in the blaze of Atlanta. She let it go without regret. Atlanta remained a part of her, even from afar. She heard from acquaintances who came through town the gossip that passed from carriage to drawing room like wildfire. Some spoke of Rhett, that he had turned more serious, more withdrawn, that he still dressed impeccably and walked with the same confident swagger, but his laughter was quieter now, and his sarcasm dulled. It pained her to hear it, to know that she had helped dim that light in him. But she also knew she couldn't fix him from a distance. She had to fix herself first. It was strange, the way memories came to her now, not in the rush of emotion, but with soft, aching clarity. She thought often of her mother, Ellen O'Hara, and the quiet strength she had wielded so gracefully. Scarlett had spent so many years trying not to be like her, afraid that gentleness was weakness, that patience meant surrender. But now she understood. Her mother had ruled Tara not with an iron will, but with grace. Scarlett had ruled with fire, and the fire had consumed too much. She spent time walking the fields with Wade, watching him grow into a boy with curious eyes and cautious smiles. He reminded her of Charles, in a distant way, though she hadn't thought of her first husband in years. She realized how little she had given Wade emotionally, how much she had buried herself in work and pride. Now, with more time and less fury, she tried to open her heart. She didn't want him to remember her as cold and unreachable. If there was a future where Rhett came back, she wanted that future to be different, one where love wasn't a battleground. The letters she almost wrote to Rhett piled in her desk, each one starting with words that felt inadequate. "I miss you. I'm sorry. Please come home." But she never sent them. She feared they would sound like pleas, like weakness, and she couldn't stand the idea of him thinking she was only sorry because she was alone. No, if she reached out, it would be because she had changed, not just in words, but in heart. One evening, as the air grew cooler and the sky stretched into gold, Mammy sat beside Scarlett and studied her long and hard. The silence between them held a lifetime of shared history, battles fought together, tears shed, truths told without needing to be spoken. Finally, Mammy said in her quiet, gravelly voice, "Miss Scarlett, you got love in you. Just didn't know how to give it. But you learnin', maybe not too late." Scarlett didn't answer right away. She just sat with those words, letting them root inside her. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe tomorrow or the next day, she'd write Rhett for real. Or maybe she'd go to Atlanta and knock on his door and tell him not with desperation, but with honesty, "I was wrong. I love you, I always did. But now I know what that means." That night, she dreamt of Rhett, not the way he had left her, with tired eyes and final words, but the way he once stood at the bottom of 12 oak stairs, looking at her with that mischievous grin and untamed affection. The memory didn't hurt as it used to. It gave her something to hope for, something to walk toward. Tara had taught her how to begin again. And if Rhett was her future, she would find a way to meet him there, not as the girl he had once mocked and loved and left, but as the woman who had finally learned what it meant to be whole. The night stretched quiet over Tara, the sky dusted with stars that shimmered faintly, like distant memories. Scarlett stood by the upstairs window, the same one where she'd once watched the road for returning soldiers and imagined ball gowns and proposals. So much had changed, and yet the land beneath her feet, the red soil of Georgia, still pulsed with the same stubborn heartbeat it always had. It had survived the war. So had she. There was a strange comfort in the stillness of the house now. No more clattering heels running down the halls in silk slippers. No more Bonnie's laughter echoing through rooms. No more Melanie's gentle voice smoothing tensions before they broke. Just the steady creak of wood, the occasional crackle of fire, the soft voice of Mammy, or the rustle of Wade's books as he turned pages late into the evening. Life had gone on, quiet and unannounced. But Scarlett was not the same girl who had once measured life in parties, suitors, and ambition. Loss had changed her. Survival had hardened her. And somewhere in between, the pieces of her scattered identity had begun to come together. She saw now how much of her life had been chasing illusions. She had believed Ashley to be her great love, when all along she had been in love with the idea of him, the security, the fantasy, the gentleness he represented. But it had never been real, not in the way she had imagined it. That realization no longer stung. It brought relief. And Rhett, he was real in every sense of the word, flesh and fire. Kindness hidden behind biting sarcasm, a mirror to her own defiance. She had fought him, pushed him away, tried to bend him to her will, and when he refused, she mistook it for rejection instead of love expressed differently. He had loved her with all her flaws, and she had only realized that when it was too late, or perhaps she dared to hope, not entirely too late. She remembered his face the last time he'd looked at her, tired and broken, all the laughter gone from his eyes. "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." The words had stung not because they were cruel, but because they were true in that moment. He had nothing left to give, and she had taken everything without giving back. But that wasn't the end of their story, at least not for her. not if she could help it. Each day at Tara, Scarlett found strength in doing what she had always known best: rebuilding, reclaiming. She worked the fields again. She helped the tenants. She made the accounts tighter. But this time, she also paid attention to what could not be counted or measured. She asked Mammy about her aches. She listened when Wade spoke about dreams. She walked with Ella through the fields, hand in hand, saying nothing but sharing warmth. There was healing in that, a slow reawakening of something she had buried under layers of pride and desperation. What she had always feared, being alone, didn't feel so frightening now. She had known loneliness even when surrounded by people. Now she was learning solitude, and the difference was vast. She had space to think, to breathe, to hope. And hope, she realized, was not about clinging to the past. It was about daring to believe the future could still hold something beautiful. The memory of Rhett never left her, not in the quiet of night or in the bustle of day. But now she remembered him with less fire and more tenderness. She saw the moments she had missed, the way he had tucked Bonnie in, the way he had looked at her when she wasn't watching, the way he had tried over and over to reach her. She had not seen it then, blinded by her own expectations of love, but she saw it now, and it humbled her. She no longer dreamed of Atlanta's glittering society. She dreamed of a porch with Rhett beside her, silence between them not heavy with anger, but comfortable with knowing. She dreamed of laughter returning to his voice, of his arms around her again, not out of passion, but out of peace. But she didn't wait for it to come to her. Scarlett O'Hara had never been one to wait. One morning, she sat down with pen and paper, not with trembling hands, but steady ones. She didn't craft grand speeches. She simply wrote the truth. "I was wrong," she wrote, "about Ashley, about love, about you. I didn't know what it meant then, but I do now, and I still love you. That hasn't changed, but I have. If you still carry even a piece of what we had, I'll be here." She didn't sign it with anything dramatic, just Scarlett, simple, honest. She handed the letter to a courier bound for Atlanta, and then walked back to the fields, not waiting by the window, not holding her breath. Whether Rhett returned or not, she would still be herself, and that was enough. Tara stretched around her, timeless and enduring. And for the first time in her life, Scarlett O'Hara stood in its center not as a girl who had taken and demanded, but as a woman who had learned how to give. The land would always be there. She would always fight for it, but she no longer needed it to define her. She looked out at the horizon, where the light was beginning to change, not quite morning, not quite dusk. A promise lingered there, quiet and persistent. She smiled. "Tomorrow is another day," she whispered. And this time, it wasn't an escape. It was a vow. Gone with the Wind is more than a sweeping tale of war, love, and survival. It's a complex portrait of a woman who refuses to be defeated, even when everything around her crumbles. Through Scarlett O'Hara, Margaret Mitchell captured the contradictions of strength and vulnerability, pride and regret, survival and sacrifice. The novel is deeply rooted in the Old South, with all its romanticized grandeur and troubling history. And it doesn't shy away from portraying both the beauty and the brutality of that world. At its core, this is a story about human endurance, about how people adapt, how they break, and how they pick up the pieces and keep going. Scarlett is flawed, often infuriating, but never stagnant. And her journey from spoiled belle to hardened realist leaves readers with a haunting question. What are we willing to do to survive? And what does survival cost us? Even decades after its publication, the novel continues to ignite debate, stir emotion, and hold a mirror to the complexities of identity, love, and power. In the end, its most enduring message may be the quietest one, that no matter how much we lose, there's always a sliver of hope waiting in the next dawn. After all, tomorrow is another day.